into the July 2021 unrest in KwaZulu-Natal continues today in Umhlanga. The July unrest came days after the incarceration of former President Jacob Zuma. KZN and Gauteng experienced violent scenes of unrest and looting. More than 340 people lost their lives, and the damage was estimated to have exceeded 50 billion. Let's take you live to the hearings.
We are engaged with.
Will I be disturbing your train of thought if I just ask some question relating to point 1 and 2? You mentioned 5 points. Yeah. Before I go to them, maybe you could just take us into confidence about, you spoke about the 100,000 membership strong organization. What are the mechanisms that go into taking a stance on any political issue? So if you take a stance, for instance, on the unrest, or you are taking a stance on eviction, obviously we are focused on the unrest here, but you take a stance on eviction, what goes into the decision making around your political orientation as an organization, and what stance you take?
Because we are a membership-based organizations and our leaders are elected by our branches, constituencies, and communities. So each community would have what we call local council. So we've got, wherever we exist, wherever we have membership, we'll have leaders and coordinators. And then we meet at a national level on a monthly basis, and then there are also provincial council meetings. And then we have what we call general assemblies every month, where our members, these general assemblies are open to all our members, and you can also invite anyone who is not necessarily our members. So these discussions, series of discussions do take place, so Abahlali have sufficient platforms of engaging. And we've got different structures also within. We have also the Women's League, also to make sure that the rights of women are taken seriously within the movement, and we have the Youth League as well. So I'm saying these different structures meet on a monthly basis because there are different meetings. So we had a series of discussions about what happened. A very interesting and concrete conversation, what people told us, how they felt about whether participating or not participating in the food riot that actually took place. Because of our regular popular education, because Abahlali, a lot of public would understand Abahlali when we are engaging to protest outside, but very few understand that Abahlali also do a lot of intellectual work and discussions inside, where really you can confirm that poor people can think as well. So these discussions have taken place where we have reached a conclusion that these particular 5 points, and of course we've made some also recommendation what we think could assist this country moving forward. So this is not just my personal view. There's been a series of discussions within the organizations to come up to the conclusion that we have in terms of our view.
Yeah, certainly. Even the statement is actually published under the name of the movement itself.
Absolutely, after a series of discussions.
Yes. And then when you mentioned point 1 about ordinary black people don't have water and sanitation, and that the anger of the poor could go in many directions. So maybe you can assist this, our investigations, because in our research and in some of the testimony we've heard, there seemed to be an emerging perspective that at least some part of the unrest was organized. How do we make sense of that tension between, I think that you come in quite strong on what it is that might have led, say, poor communities and their involvement and role, but what do we do with information coming up that there may very well have been an orchestrated dimension? Not only that the whole thing was orchestrated, that there may have been orchestrated dimensions either at the center of it or so forth. How should we deal with those tensions?
Well, there's a truth in that such anger has just been waiting for, when we are sitting on the ticking time bomb. So it was just waiting for a one to light, to spark a light for this uprising to actually start. So the ground was fertile enough and waiting for somebody or a leader that is legitimate, that have some kind of respect to people. So it is correct that the arrest, of course, of the former president has given rise and have made the already fertile ground ready for these, food riots to mention. We also agree with the view that this riot was also planned at a very high political level. And given to what we have done when we've seen this, for instance, I tried myself to contact the premier of this province, who would not answer my call, who would not even answer my WhatsApp. And I had to do that because of the circulating, there were media, text messages that were circulating on the social media. And there was one particular one amongst the conversation that was had by the ruling African National Congress. There was one that says, we now know the home of the Deputy Chief Justice, and it's now time to attack. And I felt that my conscience would not be clean if I were to keep quiet with that, knowing very well that there's already been so much damage on the property, but there is now a specific target to the home of the Deputy Chief Justice was sharing this on the commission. Then I knew it was serious. It was for that reason why I took privilege to call the Premier. I have never had such contact or conversation with the Premier, but I thought I was reminded of the duty that I have, duty to God, duty to my country, that I would be failing South Africa. I would be failing the life of the Deputy Chief Justice and others whose lives were also at risk. It was not just the property that was targeted. So, to my surprise, as always, the Premier wouldn't answer my call, wouldn't answer my WhatsApp. And the messages that I had were very sensitive that I could share with anybody, even with the police, because at that time it was clear that the police have taken a very clear stance of rather colluding with what was happening. So the only person I thought I could trust at least was the Premier of the province, because I thought he had taken an oath somehow. And one of that to uphold the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. And I thought, as a citizen, I have a duty as well to assist, give the necessary information for the authorities to act, only to find that there was a leadership vacuum. Nobody existed for anything. Nobody wanted to take any responsibility of anything that was happening.
Yeah, there is a question later on in a conversation that specifically will want some specific commentary on the government's. Oh, sorry. I was just saying that later on there will be a question that requests just a substantive response to the question of the government's handling of the unrest in particular. So we'll definitely get there. But I perhaps wanted to ask also about this. Why do you think it was planned at a high scale? Is there anything in particular about the way that the unrest unfolded that you think justifies a reasonable presumption that it was indeed, there was a planned aspect to it?
Oh, yes, no, absolutely. Fortunately, we live in the community. We speak to the people. We speak to ordinary people, whether people who belong to political parties, and we also know what is happening within the ruling party. And we are aware of the factions within the ruling party. Some of our members, obviously, are members of these political parties. So that's how we get information, because there's no abstract about it. It is happening in our communities, right on our faces. We were aware that, of course, I think mostly many South Africans would concur that there were threats already that should the former president be arrested, the country would be ungovernable. Almost everybody knew about that. So, but also, what made us to really think this was really planned at a higher level was this didn't take as a surprise. It took step by step, from the expulsion of the mayor here in eThekwini, whom our understanding is that she has had a very close tie with the former president, that's when things began to go wrong with the forces of one faction of the mayor who's aligned to the former president, needed to, one way or the other, stand in solidarity with the president, the former president. Now, if they were to be successful in defending the president not to go to jail, the first thing they should be doing is to make sure that his key people, like the former mayor here, does not lose power, the positions within the ruling party, within the city. Now, the fact that that faction of the ruling party failed, and the mayor found herself expelled, from the mayoral positions, that meant that then it would be, the former president would be vulnerable, because it means his allies are no longer strong. So we've been reading things through that political perspective, what is happening within the ruling party, and some of them who are our members who know exactly what is happening. So we could also, of course, read from the text messages that we have. There were people who were saying, comrade, let us not use the regalia of the party, of the African National Congress, because we will be easily identified. And it was clear that it's a faction of the ANC that is not just angry about the arrest of the former president, but what was unfolding within the party, which also involved people at the regional levels, like in the case of the mayor, for instance.
Okay. And I'm still on this now, point one that you spoke with, of ordinary black people, lack of water, sanitation, and poverty as being kind of like, I don't know, a ticking time bomb is the expression you used. So we are very careful, obviously, because we are still investigating, right? So it will be difficult to have a diagnosis before we have heard all of the evidence. But is there a reason why, even when you, perhaps when you focus on the poor and their neglect by government, what is, was there any thought into like using words like looting and rioting? Because we've been careful not to use those words, right? Because we wanted to think about them. I mean, if we accept that sociological issues of injustice and poverty are behind that, then it might require that a new language be formulated to make sense of it. Or do you think, I just wanted some commentary on the use of the words looting and riots, destruction.
There has been a number of debates, of course, about how we frame, how we term what was happening. And we reach a stage, of course, there are elements of criminality. I think we all agree with that. But there was a point where we decided to call this as a food riot, because at the same time, we didn't want to be so quickly judgmental and criminalize poverty that already existed, that already was created. We thought it was a riot as a political act rather than it's being seen as a criminal act. Why a political act? Because for too long, I think it is known that people are poor. The inequalities, the levels of poverty that exist in this country, and the failure of the state to create jobs or create conducive environment for the private sector to do so, whatever one thinks how jobs are created. But we feel that the government hasn't really done enough to make sure that they deal with poverty, that there's employment and so on. Now, this is not to justify that looting, whatever you call it, was okay, but we are saying, we have been saying that it is not correct, it is not only just criminal, but it is immoral for people not to have land, not to have food, I think the country has to take responsibility. It cannot be normal. It cannot be business as usual. People would have found other ways, even if there wasn't a Zuma moment of this nature. But this was going to come. We were seeing it coming in many ways. Also through the level of anger. We've seen with anger against migrant communities through xenophobia, the minority groups, your LGBTIQ plus communities having been under constant attacks. The level of hate and anger that we believe is being created when people are denied access to jobs, access to better opportunities, even the right to the city, as we are just fighting for a simple right to the city.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that. I mean, these questions are difficult, but we are leaning on you as we, are reckoning with it ourselves as the investigation unfolds. But how do you think, given the intellectual wealth of the movement and experience, how do we balance both the issue, say, of destruction of property, of looting, of stealing of goods, while at the same time trying to also make sense of the socio-economic issue that you mentioned that actually drive that? So obviously our mandate is very broad as a Human Rights Commission. There are those who come to us saying, my property has been looted, or I'm a foreign national and I was also the target of this. At the same time, we have to understand the socio-economic dynamics that sometimes give rise to food riots, as the organization has opted to call them. How should we as investigators make sense of those, I don't know if it's tension more than contradiction?
Well, these contradictions are created. There are very smart people here and around the country who pretend that they do not know what is happening, who pretend not knowing what justice is about. It cannot be business as usual that you have the inequalities that exist in this country. The fact that you are living comfortable and your neighbor is as poor as what? And you think that is normal. It can be business as normal. So the fact that we accept that as normal, that on its own shows that there's something seriously wrong with us. Now, to make sense of that, and of course to kind of find balance, again, we sort of pretend as if we do not know. The level of greed, the level of corruption in states and in some sectors of a society, of course, are contributing to this. But the short answer would be, it cannot be fair, it cannot be just for a country like South Africa with the highest inequalities around the world to treat that as normal. You have somebody that is thinking rich. You have somebody that doesn't know where the next plate of food will come from. Now, so I just want to blame the greed. And where does it come from? Now, as long as we put profit and private property ahead of human needs, leads us to where we are. Our principle as Abahlali, and what we've always been saying, is that as long as we put commercial value of land or property before its social value, it has contributed to the situation where we are. I am glad that after we've put out the statements, there were a couple of conscious business people who came and confessed that we weren't aware what our wealth does. We've been so ignorant, not that there was some intentionally, but we didn't know the extent of our behavior, our action, that it can lead to where we are. Because suddenly what that means, it means you have this great wealth and you are not going to enjoy it as long as there's poverty on your doorsteps. As much as the hungry person is not at peace, is at war with himself because of poverty. You as the rich person who is not conscious, who's not willing to share, you cannot be at peace and you cannot therefore enjoy your wealth. So I guess the balance is to say, of course, we are not saying it's wrong to have money, to be rich, to live a comfortable life, but it cannot be uhuru until we cannot be free until our neighbors and everybody else is free. So the message is South Africans must learn to share. You don't have to be rich to share. We were brought up with Ubuntu. How can you enjoy your kids having 7 pair of shoes, school shoes, when your neighbor's child does not have shoe and you are at peace with yourself? So we must restore our own African Ubuntu. Solidarity within and between communities have to be forged.
Would you agree with the characterization of all of those horrific inequalities as themselves a form of violence?
Say that again.
Would you agree with the characterization of the inequalities that our country face as themselves a form of violence?
Absolutely. Greed is a form of violence. Wealth in the midst of so much poverty is in itself a form of violence. Silence and ignorance to poverty in itself is a form of violence.
And you stated earlier that you do not obviously support criminality and would never encourage such a thing. So maybe this leads me to the second point that you made about black people or vulnerable poor people being ruled by violence. Has the organization thought about alternatives of how one both protects property, how one peacekeeps unrest, without resorting, say, to the kind of to what the state decree tells us is effective means, such as policing or the bringing in of the defense and so forth? How do we balance that?
We have our education systems and other means in the form of izimbizo, and of course in organizations like Abahlali we have what we call popular education. And this is what we do as Abahlali. We do not wait for people to be angry before we can act. We do not wait for people to resort into violence before we can say violence is wrong. So when we reach out to communities to present about Ubuhlali, we make it clear from the onset what we stand for. The values of Ubuntu. Before we can talk about the living conditions, the challenges that people face, we begin by defining ourselves, that a human being should be defined in relation to others. Now, no human being is complete in isolation to others. That's where comes the spirit of Ubuntu. I think we need to take that much more seriously. We should not wait for crises such as what we experienced to come. I think it should be norm that we begin to raise our children with such values of Ubuntu. I'm not too sure how often do we do that in our organizations, also in our families. It's not enough that I do that with my own kids at home. And after an hour, those kids are part of a broader communities who do not teach the same values. So I guess the message that I'm saying that we need to be proactive. Let us not wait for crisis to take place before we can have such conversation. We know what inequality and injustices do, and we know that now the anger of the people who are not satisfied with whatever would lead to some of these things. Now, the difficulty that we have experienced with Abahlali has been to teach non-violence in the face of a violence. I will make an example in Mayville, here in Katomena. There's a settlement called Enkanini, Cattle Crest, and Ekenana. We are saying we should reflect the very same values of a kind of a society that we want to see in our day-to-day action. Now, how do we do that when there's so much violence in us? I have come up, I have seen a situation where the city of eThekwini would destroy shacks more than 40 times without a court order. They are law unto themselves because they are governing, and therefore it is acceptable that they can violate laws. Now, it's been extremely difficult for the leadership of Abahlali to say, behave non-violently. We don't want to create barbaric behavior. Because if we encourage this now as an organization, it's the very same kind of future we will be doing. So we are saying to Abahlali, act within the ambits of the law, but also peaceful. And therefore, the question was, how do we balance the fact that we are expected to behave with these values that were being taught in Abahlali in a non-violent manner in an environment and the state that is so violent to us? That has been a difficult question. How do you teach non-violent in a violent community, society? That has been, hence we've been encouraging and we are calling that there has to be a serious conversation across cities, a serious conversation about.
I'm actually, sorry to interrupt, I'm actually going to get to that as our final question to reflect about ways forward with reference to the statement by Abahlali. But perhaps my question was, this investigation is also concerned with accountability. We will be continuing with testimony from the police. We have heard from victims who were victims of police brutality and so forth. But the issue we are struggling with particularly, and I agree with you, I think there are foundational values, and I think our last question will hit at that more directly. But the question really is about the presence of violence during the actual active unrest. Right? What are alternatives to intervene in that, particularly in the context of an organization that's protecting the poor, protecting the vulnerable, who are at a disadvantage in terms of their relationship with the state and so forth. But what could serve as effective mechanisms during protests, during unrest of this nature, from your perspective with the poor as the central concern? Is there alternatives we should use? Is there perhaps, some people spoke about the outlawing of rubber bullets. What has the organization thought around actual active policing during,
I think it's important that we invest much more on social dialogue rather than militarizing and wanting to spend billions of rand buying arms and these highly armed vehicles that get used during the violence. So yes, we must invest more on social dialogue. But also it is important that we have accountable leaders that love their country, love their people, that engages with their communities. If you command respect and you call yourself a leader and you have a constituency, but that constituency, you have no respect over that constituency. At that time, we were expecting leadership to rise, to call for law and order. Not the police, not the army, the leadership. Now, in our case, I took liberty to make a video, at least to Abahlali constituency, whom I know would respect. They wanted to hear from the leadership. Is this okay? Because we see some highly respected people also, looting. The police are there. Why must we not do when we see such people who are driving fancy cars and so on? I know at the end that the blame was, the nation was told that only poor shack dwellers were looting. But we've seen, fancy cars and so on doing. So I'm saying at that point, we were expecting leadership to step up, command respect. Leadership is about bringing guidance, providing leadership at crucial times such as that one. We've never seen leadership. There was a leadership vacuum, which then made people to think that it is okay. Now, the biggest problem in South Africa, in as far as your question is concerned, is that whenever there's a problem, instead of leadership stepping up, they step back and then they send the police, they send the military. And there's no engagement at that point other than confrontation and also making the problem worse. So for instance, when we have grievances, which do not just go straight to the road, there would have been much efforts to try and engage, but at the point where people go out into street to protest, in most cases, leadership don't show up. Then they send the police. And I find that very problematic because by protesting, people really want to engage, they wanted to say something. How they begin to say this in the face of the military, how they begin to talk about their service delivery issues, for instance, to the police who have nothing to do with leadership and capacity to provide this leadership. So at that point, it's where we have leadership failure. So we were expecting at that time people like myself, people like the Premier, the mayors, to step up and call for their constituencies. You may not have influence around South Africa, but you have a particular constituency that you are accountable and you are expected to provide some guidance and leadership. We did not see that.
No, thank you for that. Yeah, I think those are substantive directions. I just have two more questions before handing over to my colleague, and one of them is just about the concern of the voice of the poor often being drowned out in national conversations, particularly when answers are required from all corners of society. What in your view has been the biggest blind spot from the perspective of an organization that represents poor people? What has been the one thing that you feel has not come to the surface to give expression to what might be coming from the constituency you represent?
Well, it's a simple answer that many people in many sectors of our society do not recognize that the poor, particularly the black, can think for themselves. People don't want to accept that poor people can think. They can be as reasonable as you are. They have intelligence as many people. That's the first thing. Poor people are taken for a ride. They are taken for granted, as if they have no brain. Often people want to think for us. They want to talk for us. They want to represent us. And they want to speak and conclude on our behalf. And we have fought so many times about this when people, especially the intellectuals, they have assumed that they are the vanguard of our own revolution. In other words, they think it's their job to think for us, represent us, and decide for us. And that is very problematic when you think that some people do not have the same intelligence as you are. And therefore, people are treated as if they are beneath the law. They are treated with disrespect. Each time politicians approach any informal settlement, they go there to lie, because poor people are treated as children, as if they have no brain. Each time they engage us with lies. Why? Because they think we have no brain. They think our intelligence is that of a child's intelligence. The level of lies to those who hold power, who think politics is about lying, successfully lying, because the public has agreed to that norm. That is why today corruption is normal. They tell us in our own faces that we are there in the city council, in the legislature, to eat for you, and we eat on your behalf. We are in this mess because they are messiahs who think the challenges that are facing the city, this country, is their own challenges. And therefore, the public in general have no answers to the challenges. We can just follow. The moment they recognize that the fact that you are elected into a position of power today doesn't mean that you are smarter, clever than anyone else. In fact, your wisdom should be determined by how much do you listen to the electorate, to the very same people that puts you into the positions of power. If they are able to put you there, it means they have an ability to take you down.
No, definitely. Thank you for that. I know I promised you a question that would afford you an opportunity to speak to what needs to change, but I think my colleague will inherit that since he's going to come after me. So my last question is this, and I think it's appropriate for an organization that represents the vulnerable. There's, amongst all the statistics about the amount of billions of loss to the economy and destruction to property, which is an important dimension for investigation. There's also the impact of the human impact, right? People who have died or those who are still going to face prosecution and so forth. How is your organization dealing, A, with the human impact, particularly as it relates to the death number that we still have not really settled on how many people died, but we know it's in the hundreds, and then just the aftermath of not so much rebuilding the community, that will come from my colleague, but more like prosecutions or people who will be, stigmatized or face even tougher realities after the unrest.
Our deepest condolences to those who lost their lives during this time. Imphefumulo yethu, inhliziyo nemoya yethu ayibe nabo baphumule ngokuthula. Now the problem becomes when we value property over human needs, and we have a serious problem as Abahlali where the property value becomes more urgent and important than human life. I think what we've learned from the Phoenix situation is very clear that almost our society is taught that you will have to do whatever it takes to protect property when human lives are in danger. That's less important compared to what you would have to do to protect property. And again, as I said earlier on, when we put commercial value and property value ahead of social and human needs and value, it has brought us to where we are. Now, we have seen how, even today, most of the people who are, with an exception of the Phoenix associated issue, people are more worried and concerned about the destruction of property. Of course, I'm not saying that that is not important. Losing billions of rands is not a Mickey Mouse. But how many are really, concerned about their lives, the socio-economic conditions under which people have to live? I mean, if you were to put aside the question of the Phoenix, killing, people don't think it was necessary then that angry and hungry people needed to do something in order to survive. They are concerned, obviously, about the economy and the property destruction over the human needs. When people were blockading roads in the suburbs, it was not they were not really doing that to protect lives. They were just doing that to protect their property. Right? It's easy, property. So the value of property in South Africa or in any capitalist state matters, and this is what we've witnessed. I think we have a serious problem with that. Destruction of property versus human catastrophe.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm going to hand over to Advocate Lotz to just ask a couple of questions from his side, but thank you so much.
Yes, no, thank you very much, Mr. Zigote. If you could just pull your mic a little bit closer to you, I think it will make, it'll be much more audible, I think, for the recording as well. Yeah, I've just got a few questions, and thanks for, I think you've covered quite a bit. in as far as what my colleague was probing. Now, Mr. Zigote, there was a statement that Abahlali, baseMjondolo, issued on the 13th of July, which was titled KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng are burning. We need to build a just peace. I believe that the panel also has a copy of that statement. I just want to double check with the chair.
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Yes. I'm not going to take you through the entire statement, but I'm quite interested because I think in the statement there was a specific, I think on page 4 in particular, there was a specific mention of your position as Abahlali. And of course there was a context to the challenges that you highlighted in as far as the unrest, and I think there was also reference to COVID, the impact of COVID-19 here and there. I'm just double checking with you because I think some of the issues that you've highlighted with my colleague, they were mentioned as well. In as far as I'll just make an example, like number 2, for example, in that list of 12 that you mentioned there. You highlight the riots as a result of starvation and not support for Zuma. I'm interested in that one, but you also mentioned 12 and others as well, where you say there's a need for dialogues. Perhaps my question is really two-pronged. Firstly, if you could just maybe expand on that aspect of the riots being a result of starvation and not necessarily because of the support for Zuma. Perhaps having reflected also post the July unrest, we are now in November. Is there anything else that you'd like to add? But also, would you also be able to perhaps expand on that, just so that perhaps we understand better in terms of what you meant? Especially because we take this as a statement that is coming out of Abahlali, so you're coming with that strong 100,000, membership. Yeah.
Yes, of course. That statement was compiled after an extensive consultation with members. Now, our members and many communities that we engaged were very clear that even those of us who participated in the looting had no knowledge, or we had nothing to do with the solidarity with the former president. That came out very clear. Those who took an opportunity, they did that because they did not have food and they saw an opportunity. So it doesn't mean that when you do not have food, then you have to steal. It's not normal. But people acted because they saw some credible people doing it. Law enforcement and some authorities seem to be supporting it.
We're taking you out of that process of the hearings into the July 2021 unrest. The president of Abahlali, baseMjondolo, Usibusiso Innocent Zigode, a South African Sheikh Dwellers movement, saying leadership didn't step up at this crucial time. And he says inequalities are a form of violence. Wealth in the midst of so much poverty are a form of violence. And he's saying, how do you teach non-violence in a violent society? Also making the point that poor people can think. He says intellectuals think it's their job to think for the poor. Some interesting outcomes there, and we'll take you back as soon as we're able to. But now we want to take you live to the